Hello, Michael over here. I just want to make a quick video, and I'm going to set a timer this time so I don't go over time. Uh, so I wanted to go over a couple of things that were a little bit challenging, I think, for the first response essay for a lot of you. And in all fairness, we hadn't gone over these things. So I thought I would take a moment to step back and to look at kind of the foundations of an essay, because the response essay is really intended to help you get back into the habit, or into the habit depending on where you're coming from, of writing this type of literary essay. So when we look at the uh, literary analysis or the response essays, a couple things to take into account. So the first one is 2 to 4 pages, typed double spaced is what I'm looking for. No more than 4 pages, no less than 2 pages. And just double spaced, no more than. You don't need to include the prompt at the top of the page or anything like that. No use of the pronoun I or me, right? I kind of hide our personal opinion behind academic tone, which is what we're practicing here. I want you to use specific support from the book to back up your claim. So any claim that you make about what Atwood is trying to do should have a quote to go along with it, and those quotes should be analyzed. Now, for all intents and purposes, I don't want you to use any outside sources, such as SparkNotes or Wikipedia or whatnot. The only exception would be if you are comparing the Handmaid's Tale to real life events and you want to find some extra support for that. That's totally fine with me. Okay, so when we look at the prompts, they are all relatively broad. So, and they're intended to be this way and to get broader as we work towards the literary analysis. So the first one is to look at the additional real-world events that Atwood has mined in order to develop the story. Now, alternatively, as some of you did, you could look at real-world events, contemporary events happening now that are related to or similar to things that are going on in The Handmaid's Tale, and that's fine with me as well. The second prompt is a continuation of the prompt about personal space, and in this case, it's taking into account the transgressions of space and privilege in the book. So you could think about here times where, say, Offred sneaks into the sitting room. It's a place that she's not supposed to be, right? Transgressing is like trespassing, going into a place where you shouldn't be. And this also takes place in the chapter on Jezebels, where Offred and the commander are both in a place where they shouldn't be, in fact, a place that shouldn't exist at all. And, sort of think about how these transgressions shape or change the narrative. The third one is to take into account the phrase "Nulite te vestares carborundurum," and sort of the shifting role it plays in the events that transpire in the book. If you think of this scene on the night of the ceremony when the whole household is in the sitting room, the commander says that they're going to have a silent prayer, and Offred sends up "Nolite te vestares carborundurum" as her prayer. At that point, she doesn't know what it means. She's shocked when she does discover that it's a joke, because it undermines what she thinks of as like the depth of the quote. But then I think that she does recover a little bit of the power or the strength of it. So again, you can kind of think about how this gives her hope, connection, so on and so forth. The fourth one is to compare the first 12 chapters of the book to the first 8 episodes in the TV show, and to really pick out 2 or 3 major scenes in the book and compare them with the same scenes in the TV show. I've read the book and I've seen the TV show, so I don't need a summary. I want you to look at what happens in the TV show, how they represent a certain scene, versus how it's represented in the book, and how those different representations affect an audience, and or why they did that. I understand that some of the reasons for that might be, it's easier to shoot a scene that, with fewer characters or whatnot. So I'm looking at more like changes to the TV, from the book to the TV show, that change the meaning or the way that we interpret the story. Okay, so moving on from that, one thing that occurred to me, there were two places where I felt like a lot of students were struggling, and there are normal places that students struggle in English classes: thesis statements and using evidence. So these two things are tied really, really closely together. In fact, I like to use the quotes to come up with my thesis rather than the other way around. Um, I will say that a few of you either didn't have a real clear thesis, or you had a thesis but you didn't stick to it. And as an aside, the thesis, where a professor is going to be looking for the thesis in MLA 8 format, is the last sentence of the first paragraph. And that thesis should be a clear, concise claim. So here's kind of a hypothetical example, right? So I decided that if I were to make up a new prompt for The Handmaid's Tale, and I were to look at how Atwood uses vision, right? Just vision in terms of The Handmaid's Tale, and how references to sight and vision change the story or influence the story. The first thing that I want to do is go ahead and find 5 quotes that are related to vision or seeing, and just lists them out. So I've got 5 here, and you can see that underneath I've already done a little bit of extra work, and I'll go into that in a second. So here I've got the actual quote, right? So the first one, number 1, the place in a face where an eye has been taken out. And so that's when Offer is looking at the ceiling in her new room. Now I will point out, you can look at how I have the citation here. I have the quotation, and then no period inside the quotations, and then the parentheses are around the page number, and the period occurs after that parenthesis. So very important. If I were looking at 2 different sources, then I would also include the author's last name in there, but no additional punctuation between last name and page number. The only time that I would include a punctuation mark inside the quotation is if the quote itself had an exclamation point or a question mark in it. And then I would still include that period at the end after the parenthetical citation. Okay, so I've got a couple more quotes here. I catch a glimpse of her face. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to basically go down the list, and under each one, I'm going to write down why that quote is important, right? So for number 1, in the ceiling of a room, there's a reminder of witness, the idea that she is being watched, even within her own room. It's also a reminder of a wound. Number 2, I catch a glimpse of her face, and so this is in the short scene where Offred and her partner are in the grocery store, and they see Janine, who is pregnant, and she is there to be seen. Then I've got a couple more down here that seem important to me, that seem like pretty good ones I could use. To be seen is to be, her voice trembled, penetrated. And again, so this is where there's a link being made between being seen and being violated, which is of course important for the handmaids to have this connection, right? They're supposed to be invisible. So now that I have all of these things, right, I can start to go into my key ideas. Being seen, to be seen is to be vulnerable. Everyone is always being watched. Some people want to be seen, others want to be invisible. So when I go into a possible thesis statement, I can kind of use a little bit of a template for a working thesis. Now, I wouldn't follow this explicitly all of the time, but it is a pretty good starting point for a literary analysis, especially for a quote-unquote working thesis that I may change down the road. So I have in, and then piece of writing, whatever the title is, the author, whoever the author is, uses some theme or idea in order to show or prove a point. Right? So that's my template. So for mine, or the evidence that I just showed you, I wrote, in The Handmaid's Tale by Margaret Atwood, the idea of vision is used to examine the relationship of being seen to both intimacy and vulnerability. Now, for my reader, that tells the reader, the sort of contract that I've now set up with the reader, is that the rest of that essay is going to look directly at the connection of vision to intimacy and vulnerability in The Handmaid's Tale. The nice thing is that once I have those quotes, I can look at which quotes work together. So if I have, say, 2 or 3 quotes about vulnerability, I can put those in the same paragraph. If I have 2 or 3 quotes about someone always watching, I can put those in a paragraph. And as a side note, I probably would try and stick with just 1 or 2 quotes per paragraph, because again, the more quote you include, the more that you have to explain it or examine it, which is again why we try and avoid beginning or ending a paragraph with a quote, because if you do so, kind of leaving it up to your reader to interpret. Okay, so then I have my thesis and I can start to piece together my body paragraphs. Now, in all honesty, if I was to go ahead and write this essay about the use of vision or the theme of vision within The Handmaid's Tale, I would likely go ahead and find way more than 5 quotes. I would go through every chapter that I'd read and mark down every instance of a vision or sight or being seen, even if it was somewhat of a tangent. And then after each one, I would try and categorize what's happening. Why is it important? Is it a theme of vulnerability? Is it the theme of intimacy? What's going on? Once I do that, then I can sift my quotes into little boxes or compartments and say, here are all the quotes that have to do with vulnerability. Here are all the ones that have to do with, violation, whatever, right? So, and in that way, I can begin to see what I have, right? And once you see kind of all the information that you have, you can begin to chunk it into little categories and then turn those into paragraphs. So for response essay 2, I strongly encourage you to really, really work on having a working thesis, and that working thesis is the guiding principle. Working because it's changeable and malleable, and you may alter it at some point. And I also encourage you to begin with, what's the prompt? What's the main part of the prompt? Real life events. What are all the real life events or whatnot, or what are all the situations of space and power that you see, and how can you kind of categorize those out, right? So I think that's it. I think I'm going to stop there. And there are 2 other videos up here on in the same module, hopefully if I've linked everything correctly, that I'd like you to take a look at as well that address similar ideas, okay? Email me if you have questions, comments, concerns, and I will talk to you all later. Have a good one.